"Shut up, you're freezing. Tonight you're sleeping between us," the two Apaches said. The desert night was colder than anything the young traveler had ever felt. He pulled his thin coat tighter around his shoulders, but it barely helped. Each gust of wind seemed to cut through him, reaching deep into his bones. His teeth chattered, and he could feel the numbness spreading in his fingers and toes. The moon hung high in the sky, pale and distant, casting long shadows across the sandy land. The silence was almost complete, broken only by the occasional sound of the wind brushing across the sparse desert shrubs. He had been walking for hours, hoping to reach shelter, but the path had seemed endless. Every step he took felt heavier than the last. His legs ached, his stomach growled faintly, and he realized that he was completely unprepared for the harsh night ahead. He stopped for a moment to catch his breath. Leaning against a rock, he tried to make sense of where he was. The landscape looked strange and unfamiliar. Rolling dunes stretched as far as he could see, and the outline of low hills appeared in the distance. He remembered hearing stories of people lost in the desert, how the cold could be just as dangerous as the heat during the day. The thought made him shiver even more. His eyes scanned the horizon, searching desperately for any sign of life, a fire, a camp, even a small cabin. But there was nothing, only the moonlight and the vast emptiness surrounding him. He had started the day with hope and determination. The morning had been warm, and he had set out early, carrying only a small bag with water and a few supplies. He had thought he could manage, thinking the journey wouldn't take long, but he had underestimated the desert. The sun had been fierce, and the sand burned his feet through his thin shoes. By mid-afternoon, he had already felt the first signs of exhaustion, but he had pushed on, telling himself that he was almost there. Now, with the cold creeping in and the shadows growing longer, he realized how unprepared he really was. As he walked slowly, his mind wandered to his family and friends. He thought about how they would worry if they knew he was out here alone. He remembered his mother's voice, soft and caring, telling him to always dress warmly in cold weather and to never wander too far without knowing where he was going. He wished he had listened more carefully. Regret washed over him, but there was no one to hear his thoughts, no one to comfort him. The desert was indifferent, and he was painfully aware of his own smallness in such a vast place. The night grew darker, and the wind stronger. He pulled his coat tighter again, but the cold still found its way to him. He stumbled over a rock, falling briefly onto the sand. As he picked himself up, he noticed something in the distance, a faint movement, small and quick. His heart jumped, and for a moment he wondered if it was an animal, maybe a coyote or a desert fox. He held his breath and focused, squinting to get a better look. Slowly, he realized it was not an animal but two people walking toward him. The sight was both comforting and intimidating. Relief surged through him, but he was also nervous. He had never met these people, and he did not know whether they were friendly. He straightened his coat, trying to make himself look less weak, even though he knew they could see the shivering hands and the exhausted expression on his face. As the two figures drew closer, he noticed that they moved with a quiet confidence. They were tall, with strong, steady steps, and they seemed to know the desert in a way he could only admire. When they finally reached him, one of the men spoke. The voice was firm but not unkind. "Shut up, you're freezing," he said, and the young traveler felt a mix of surprise and relief. The words were not harsh. They were practical, almost like a command meant to save him rather than to hurt him. The second man nodded and added, "Tonight you're sleeping between us." The traveler felt warmth in his chest, a small flicker of hope. He had not expected anyone to care, and now these strangers were offering him safety. He tried to speak to thank them, but his voice came out as a weak, breathless whisper. The men did not seem to mind. They gestured for him to follow, pointing toward a small cluster of shelters nearby. The traveler's legs felt stiff and unsteady, but he managed to keep pace. Every step toward the shelter felt like a step away from danger, a step toward warmth and security. The men moved silently, but their presence was reassuring. There was a sense of understanding in the air, an unspoken agreement that he was now under their protection for the night. As they approached the shelters, he could see the small fire flickering in the distance, casting a warm glow against the cold night. The smell of wood smoke reached his nose, sharp and comforting at the same time. He felt an almost childlike relief, as though he had returned home after a long, frightening journey. The men stopped near the fire and gestured for him to sit. One of them handed him a blanket, thick and soft, and he wrapped it around himself, feeling the heat slowly seep into his frozen body. The simple act felt like magic after hours of struggling in the cold. The traveler looked at the two men more closely for the first time. Their faces were calm and composed, with lines that suggested experience and wisdom. Their eyes were steady and alert, watching him carefully as if assessing whether he was truly in need of help. Despite the initial bluntness of their words, there was kindness there, a quiet, strong, reliable kind of kindness that comes from knowing how to survive and care for others in difficult circumstances. He realized that in this desert, kindness was not spoken loudly. It was shown through actions, through attention, through protection. He sat by the fire, slowly letting his body warm up. The cold still lingered in his fingers and toes, but the fear that had been gnawing at him was beginning to fade. He thought about how different this night was from any other night he had experienced. In a city, warmth and shelter were easy to find, often taken for granted. Here in the vast desert, the simplest gestures, the fire, the blankets, the presence of the two men were life-saving. He felt grateful deeply and silently for their attention and care. The men did not press him to speak. They seemed to understand that words were not necessary right now. Instead, they busied themselves with tending the fire, arranging a space for him between them, and making sure he was comfortable. The traveler noticed small details. The careful way one man adjusted the blanket around his shoulders, the subtle nods exchanged between the two, the shared glances that spoke of trust and teamwork. He realized that he was witnessing not just kindness, but a quiet way of life that valued protection, observation, and shared responsibility. As the night grew colder, the traveler felt himself relaxing for the first time in hours. His shivering subsided, replaced by a slow warmth spreading through his body. The wind continued to howl outside, but inside the small circle of fire and blankets, he felt safe. He thought about the day ahead, about the journey that had brought him here, and about the people who had unexpectedly become his protectors. For now, he simply allowed himself to be present, to feel the comfort of warmth and the reassurance of human care. Though he had not expected anything from this night, he now understood the power of being seen and helped in moments of vulnerability. It was a lesson that went beyond mere survival. It was about trust, empathy, and the quiet strength that comes from helping another without expectation. The desert night continued its silent vigil, but the traveler no longer felt alone. Between these two strangers, he found not only safety but a sense of belonging, however temporary. The memory of this night would stay with him, a reminder of the simple yet profound human connection that can appear in the most unexpected places. The traveler woke to the faint glow of dawn. The desert was still cold, but the first rays of sunlight painted the horizon with gentle orange and pink colors. He blinked several times, trying to adjust to the light. The fire from the night before had burned down to glowing embers, and the blankets around him still held some warmth. For a moment, he felt reluctant to leave the safety of the small circle the two Apaches had made for him. Everything outside seemed vast and overwhelming, but here he had warmth, shelter, and protection. The two men were already awake. They moved quietly, almost as if they had a routine for each morning. One of them went to gather small sticks and branches to revive the fire, while the other began checking their surroundings. The traveler watched them closely, fascinated by their calm efficiency. Every movement seemed purposeful, yet effortless. They didn't speak much, only exchanging short words or gestures, but their connection was clear. The traveler realized that these men had learned how to live in harmony with the desert, understanding its dangers and its gifts in a way he could hardly imagine. Finally, one of the men looked at him and said softly, "Eat something. You need energy for the day." He handed the traveler a small bundle of dried meat and corn bread. The traveler took it gratefully. The food was simple, but it was enough to give him strength. As he ate, he noticed the quiet pride in the men's faces. They were not boastful, yet their way of life spoke volumes. They survived in a harsh environment not through fear or aggression, but through skill, patience, and mutual care. The traveler wanted to ask questions about them, about their lives, but he hesitated. He did not want to appear intrusive. Still, his curiosity was too strong to ignore. How do you manage out here?" he asked finally, his voice small and uncertain. The men exchanged a glance, then one of them gestured for him to follow. They walked a short distance away from the shelter, toward a cluster of low rocks and small bushes. "This is where we find water sometimes," the man explained. His voice was quiet but steady. "The desert hides it. You have to know where to look." He pointed to a narrow crevice between the rocks. There was a small puddle of water, barely more than a cupful, but it reflected the morning sun. The traveler knelt beside it, amazed at how such a small amount could be life-giving. He drank carefully, feeling the cold liquid revitalize his body. He had never realized how precious water could be, how much effort it might take to find even a little. They moved slowly, walking through the desert as the sun rose higher. The traveler tried to keep up, but the uneven sand and his stiff legs made it difficult. The Apache seemed unaffected, stepping easily over rocks and around small bushes. They paused occasionally, pointing out tracks in the sand or small plants that could be used for food or medicine. Every detail was meaningful to them, every movement part of a larger understanding of their environment. The traveler felt humbled. He had thought he knew survival, but here he realized how little he truly understood. At one point, they stopped near a small ridge overlooking a wide valley. The view was breathtaking. The desert stretched endlessly, dotted with small shrubs and distant hills. The sunlight made the sand shimmer, and the traveler felt a strange mix of awe and fear. The landscape was beautiful, but it was also dangerous. He remembered how lost he had felt the night before, shivering and unsure of where to go. Now standing here, he could see both the vastness of the desert and the skill it took to live in it. One of the men crouched and began pointing to tracks in the sand. "See these?" he asked. "Deer, coyote, sometimes people. The desert leaves signs if you know how to read them." The traveler leaned closer, trying to understand. At first it was confusing. The tracks were small, delicate, and easy to miss. But as the man explained, showing the direction of travel, the size of the prints, and the depth of the impressions, the traveler began to see the pattern. He realized that the desert was not empty. It was full of life, full of stories hidden in the sand. They continued walking, and the traveler felt a growing sense of respect for these men. They lived in a world so different from his own, yet they were not afraid. They had learned to understand it, to move within it safely. He felt a small spark of confidence as they walked together. Perhaps he, too, could learn something from them. Perhaps he could survive if he listened and observed carefully. By late morning, they arrived at a small cluster of trees near a shallow stream. The water was clearer and colder than the puddle they had found earlier. The traveler knelt to drink, marveling at how refreshing it was. The men set up a small area to rest, gathering stones for a fire and arranging sticks for cooking. One of them handed the traveler a few pieces of dried fruit, which he ate with gratitude. He realized that even simple things, food, water, warmth, could feel like a feast in the desert. The day passed slowly, filled with small lessons. The traveler learned how to start a fire using dry wood and small twigs, how to find shade and conserve energy, and how to observe the landscape for signs of danger or resources. The men explained these things patiently, without rushing, allowing him to make mistakes and learn from them. The traveler felt a growing sense of accomplishment. For the first time in a long time, he was not just surviving, he was learning, adapting, and understanding. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with deep reds and purples, the men prepared a small meal. The traveler watched them move with confidence and care. They did not speak much, but the silence was comfortable. It was a silence built on understanding and trust. He thought about how different his life had been before this journey. In the city, everything was immediate and easy: food, shelter, safety. Here, he had to pay attention, to respect the environment, to work with others. It was difficult, yes, but it was also rewarding. That night they sat around the fire once more. The traveler felt exhausted but alive. His muscles ached, and his body still felt cold in places, but there was a deep satisfaction in what he had learned and experienced that day. The two men shared small stories of the desert, of animals and plants, of lessons learned from elders. Though the traveler did not understand every word, he felt the meaning behind them, the respect for life, the patience required to survive, and the quiet pride in self-reliance. Before sleep, one of the men looked at him and said, "Tomorrow we will go farther. The desert is wide, but you will learn." The words were simple, but they carried reassurance. The traveler realized he was beginning to trust these men completely. He felt a connection, not just for the protection they offered, but for the knowledge and understanding they shared. The night was still cold, but for the first time he did not feel alone or helpless. He had learned that survival was not just about enduring the cold. It was about learning, observing, and respecting the world around him. As he lay down between the two men, wrapped in blankets, he reflected on the day. He had been afraid, lost, and cold, but he had also discovered strength and courage he did not know he possessed. The desert was harsh, yes, but it was also a teacher, and he was beginning to understand its lessons. Sleep came slowly, but it was peaceful, filled with the sense that he was in the right place, under the care of those who knew and respected the land. The traveler woke to the sound of wind rustling through the sparse desert bushes. The sun was just rising, casting golden light across the dunes. Overnight, the cold had faded somewhat, but the morning still carried a crisp chill. The fire from last night had died down, leaving small embers glowing faintly. He slowly got up, rubbing his arms to chase away the remaining stiffness. Sitting up between the two Apaches, he felt a strange mix of gratitude and nervous anticipation. Today, he had been told, they would venture deeper into the desert. The two men were already awake, moving with the quiet efficiency that had impressed him yesterday. They checked their supplies carefully: water, dried food, and some small tools for the journey ahead. One of them gestured for the traveler to gather his things. His bag was light, but he could feel the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. The desert, he realized, was not a place to be careless. Even small mistakes could become dangerous. As they began walking, the traveler tried to keep pace. The sand was uneven and soft in places, making each step more tiring than the last. He noticed how easily the Apache moved, their feet seeming to glide over the ground without sinking. They paused occasionally, pointing out animal tracks, small plants, and unusual rock formations. Every detail had a story or a purpose. The traveler struggled to absorb it all, feeling both fascinated and overwhelmed. The desert, he realized, was alive with hidden details that most outsiders would never notice. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed higher, and the heat began to press down. The traveler could feel sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool morning. The Apache moved steadily, unbothered by the warmth. They occasionally offered him sips of water, which he gratefully accepted. The traveler realized how important it was to stay hydrated and to pace himself. He had underestimated the desert's challenges before, but now he was learning that survival depended on attention, patience, and endurance. Suddenly, the traveler noticed dark clouds forming on the horizon. The wind picked up, carrying dust and grit. The desert, which had seemed quiet and predictable, was now changing. The two Apache paused and scanned the horizon carefully. One of them pointed toward a nearby ridge and said something in a low voice. Though the traveler didn't understand the words, the urgency in their tone was clear. They were preparing for something unexpected, something that required immediate attention. A sudden gust of wind struck, and sand began to whip around them. The traveler squinted, trying to protect his eyes. The two men moved quickly but calmly, guiding him toward a natural shelter formed by rocks. They crouched low, positioning themselves so that he would be shielded from the worst of the wind. For the traveler, fear rose sharply. He had never experienced anything like this before. The desert's beauty, which had seemed so comforting yesterday, now felt threatening. As the storm continued, the traveler huddled between the two men, feeling the harsh wind tearing at his clothes and face. They stayed close, speaking to each other in short, sharp words. One of them placed a hand on the traveler's shoulder, a silent reassurance that he would be safe. The traveler realized how much he depended on their knowledge and presence. Alone, he would have been exposed and vulnerable. With them, he felt a flicker of courage amidst the fear. The storm lasted for nearly an hour. During that time, the traveler felt every ounce of cold, every stinging grain of sand. Yet he also began to notice small details. The way the men adjusted their positions to shield him, the way they used their clothing and blankets to protect themselves, and how they remained calm even when the storm seemed to rage without end. There was a lesson in their composure, a lesson about patience, resilience, and understanding the environment rather than fighting it. When the storm finally began to subside, the traveler was exhausted, his body sore from the struggle to maintain balance and protect himself. The two men helped him stand, guiding him toward a small clearing where the sun now shone warmly. The sand was still rough, and debris from the storm littered the ground, but there was a sense of relief in the air. The traveler took deep breaths, feeling his body slowly recover. He realized how fragile human comfort could be in nature, and how much courage and skill it required to endure hardships. They paused near a cluster of small shrubs, and one of the men gestured for the traveler to sit. He handed him some dried food and water, which the traveler accepted hungrily. The warmth of the sun and the simple act of eating restored some of his energy. As he chewed slowly, he reflected on what had just happened. He had faced a real threat, something far beyond his ordinary life, and he had survived. But he knew survival was not enough. He needed to learn, observe, and grow stronger if he was to continue this journey safely. The Apache, sensing his reflection, began to demonstrate small techniques for coping with the desert environment. One man showed him how to identify safe areas for shelter, using natural rocks and vegetation to shield against wind or sun. Another explained how to find and conserve water, even in the driest conditions. The traveler tried to follow their guidance carefully, attempting to mimic their movements and observations. At first, it felt awkward and difficult, but slowly, he began to understand the patterns and reasoning behind their actions. As the afternoon passed, the heat intensified. The traveler's energy dipped again, and he felt the familiar sting of fatigue. The Apache, however, moved with consistent efficiency, taking minimal rest and conserving their strength. They guided him to a shallow depression in the sand, where he could rest in the shade of a small rock. "Slow and steady," one of the men said, and the traveler understood that patience was as important as speed. Survival required not just physical strength, but also mental discipline and careful attention to one's limits. Despite the exhaustion, the traveler found himself learning and appreciating more about the desert with each step. He noticed how the Apache read the wind, identifying changes that signaled storms or temperature shifts. He observed how they watched the sky, learning the subtle changes in cloud patterns and sunlight. They listened for the faintest sounds, the distant movement of animals, and the slight shifts in the sand that revealed tracks. Every observation was a skill, every skill a lesson in respect and survival. By late afternoon, the group reached a small, hidden oasis. The traveler had not expected water or greenery, but there it was, palm trees, a shallow pool of water, and the sound of birds chirping quietly. The Apache smiled at the traveler's astonishment. Here, they explained, was a place of rest and replenishment, a reward for patience and careful observation. The traveler drank deeply from the pool, letting the cool water soothe his tired body. He felt a sense of accomplishment, as if he had crossed an invisible barrier between helplessness and competence. The two men prepared a small meal, using simple tools to cook over a small fire. The traveler helped as best as he could, chopping small branches and arranging stones. While the food was plain, the act of preparing it together felt significant. He began to understand that survival was not just about individual endurance, but about collaboration, trust, and shared effort. The Apache taught him without judgment, offering guidance rather than criticism, and he realized how valuable this approach was. As night fell, the traveler felt a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. The storm, the heat, and the long journey had pushed him to his limits, but he had endured. More importantly, he had learned. The Apache patience and guidance had transformed fear into understanding, helplessness into cautious competence. He lay down between the two men once more, feeling the warmth of the fire and their protective presence. For the first time, he did not fear the desert. Instead, he respected it. He understood that survival depended not only on physical strength but also on observation, patience, and trust in those who had experience. That night, as he drifted into a deep sleep, he dreamed not of danger or fear, but of the lessons he had learned. He pictured the tracks in the sand, the hidden water, the subtle signs of life all around. He realized that the desert, harsh as it could be, had its own rhythm and rules. And with the guidance of the two men, he was beginning to understand those rules. He felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for their protection, but for the knowledge they shared and the patience they showed. The traveler woke before dawn. The air was crisp and quiet, and the desert stretched endlessly before him, painted in shades of blue and gold as the first light of morning crept across the dunes. He rubbed his eyes and stretched slowly, feeling the lingering soreness from the day before. The journey deeper into the desert would not be easy, he knew, but he was beginning to feel a growing confidence in his ability to manage the harsh conditions. His mind replayed the lessons from the past 2 days, the careful observation, the patience, and the trust he had learned to place in the two Apache guiding him. The two men were already awake, moving with the quiet, efficient precision that had impressed him from the start. They prepared for the day, gathering supplies and checking water pouches carefully. The traveler followed their movements, trying to match their rhythm. The desert was calm at this hour, but he knew it could turn unpredictable at any moment. The lessons from the storm 2 days ago still lingered in his memory, a reminder that even experienced travelers must respect the desert's power. They began walking shortly after sunrise. The sand was cooler in the morning, but the heat would rise quickly, and the traveler knew he had to pace himself. The Apache moved confidently, their feet making almost no sound on the soft sand. They paused occasionally, pointing out subtle tracks in the sand, small animals, birds, even insects. Every detail mattered, and the traveler tried to focus, taking note of what they pointed out. He realized that survival was not just about staying alive. It was about understanding the world around you and moving carefully within it. By late morning, the sun climbed higher, and the desert heat became more intense. The traveler could feel the sweat running down his face and the sting of sand against his skin. His energy waned, and he felt a creeping exhaustion. The Apache noticed immediately and slowed their pace, allowing him to rest in the shade of a small rock formation. One of them gestured for him to drink water and eat a small portion of dried food. As he did, he realized how fragile human strength could be in this environment. A small misstep, a lack of attention, or insufficient water could make the desert deadly. They moved again after a short rest. The traveler struggled to keep up, his legs aching and his breaths coming faster. The two men guided him carefully, occasionally offering a hand to steady him over tricky patches of sand and rocks. The desert felt endless, and the traveler began to feel the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. He wondered if he had underestimated the difficulty of venturing deeper into the wilderness. Despite his growing skills, he was still inexperienced, and the desert had a way of testing even those who tried their best. Around midday, they came to a wide, open area where the sand stretched uninterrupted for miles. The heat radiated fiercely from the ground, and the traveler's feet sank deeper with every step. He felt the first waves of panic creeping in. His mouth was dry, his energy fading, and the vast emptiness made him feel smaller than ever. The two Apache noticed his hesitation. One placed a firm hand on his shoulder, steadying him. "Slow," he said in a calm, low voice. "Breathe, watch the sand, take one step at a time." The words were simple, but they carried reassurance. The traveler nodded and tried to calm himself. He took slow, deliberate steps, focusing on the ground immediately in front of him rather than the overwhelming distance ahead. The Apache moved beside him, their presence both protective and encouraging. He realized that the desert was as much a mental challenge as a physical one. Fear could paralyze him, but focus, patience, and trust in his guides allowed him to move forward. Hours passed, and the heat became almost unbearable. The traveler's shirt clung to his back with sweat, and his legs felt heavy and slow. He stumbled once, falling to his hands and knees. The two men were immediately at his side, helping him up and urging him to drink more water. The traveler felt a mixture of frustration and gratitude. He hated feeling so weak, yet he could not deny that without their help, he would have been in serious danger. He began to understand the importance of relying on others when necessary, even while maintaining his own determination. By late afternoon, dark clouds began forming on the horizon. The traveler's heart sank slightly, remembering the storm from 2 days ago. The two Apache scanned the sky, their faces serious. "Change is coming," one said. "We must prepare." The traveler quickly understood that he needed to be ready. The wind picked up, carrying dust and small debris. The desert, calm one moment, could become dangerous the next. He felt a renewed sense of urgency and focused all his energy on keeping pace with his guides. As the first strong gusts of wind arrived, the Apache led him to a natural shelter between rocks and low hills. The storm hit faster and harder than he had expected. Sand whipped around him, stinging his face and hands. He crouched low, trying to protect himself, while the two men shielded him with blankets and their bodies. The traveler's heart pounded with fear. He had survived the desert before, but the storm felt relentless, testing his limits. He clutched the blankets, trusting his guides completely. The storm continued for hours. The traveler struggled to stay calm, his energy drained from the heat, the long walk, and the stress of the storm. The Apache remained composed, adjusting their positions to provide the best protection. At one point, a strong gust knocked the traveler off balance. One of the men grabbed his arm and steadied him instantly. "Breathe," he said. "You can do this." The traveler realized that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to continue despite it. When the storm finally began to subside, the traveler was exhausted, his clothes covered in sand, and his body aching from the effort to survive. The Apache helped him stand, guiding him to a small area where the wind was less intense. He drank water and ate a small portion of food, feeling his strength slowly returning. The desert, he realized, demanded respect, patience, and endurance. He had learned these lessons through experience, and the knowledge felt more powerful than any advice given in words. As evening approached, they moved again, navigating the rough terrain with care. The traveler noticed the subtle signs that the Apache used to read the land, the way the sand shifted underfoot, the movement of distant birds, the direction of the wind. He tried to imitate them, paying attention to every detail. Though he was still learning, he felt a small surge of pride. He was no longer completely helpless. He could observe, understand, and respond, even in the harshest conditions. Finally, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the desert in deep oranges and purples, they reached a small, hidden valley with a few trees and a shallow pool of water. The Apache gestured for the traveler to rest. The fire was rekindled, and he wrapped himself in blankets, feeling the warmth seep into his bones. Despite the exhaustion, he felt a profound sense of achievement. He had faced extreme conditions, survived a storm, and learned more about the desert than he could have imagined. That night, as he lay between the two men once more, the traveler reflected on the day. He realized that the desert was more than just sand and sun. It was a teacher, a challenge, and a reminder of human resilience. He understood that survival required not just physical endurance, but patience, careful observation, and trust in those who knew the land. The lessons were hard-earned, but they were invaluable. As he drifted into sleep, the traveler felt a quiet sense of gratitude. He had been tested, pushed to his limits, and yet he had survived and grown stronger. The Apache guidance, patience, and unwavering presence had made the difference. The desert had not defeated him. Instead, it had taught him resilience, courage, and the power of trust. And for the first time, he felt not fear but respect and understanding. The traveler woke to the soft glow of early morning. The desert was calm, almost peaceful, a striking contrast to the harshness he had faced over the past days. He stretched slowly, feeling his muscles sore but stronger in ways he hadn't recognized before. The long journey, the storms, and the endless sun and sand had tested him, but now he felt a quiet confidence. The lessons he had learned from the two Apache were not just about survival. They were about patience, observation, trust, and respect for the world around him. The two men were already awake, moving with the calm precision he had come to admire. They prepared for the day, gathering supplies and checking their water pouches. One of them gestured for him to do the same. The traveler packed his small bag carefully, mindful of the lessons he had learned. Always conserve water, always check your surroundings, and always stay aware of the signs of the desert. He realized that even simple preparation could mean the difference between danger and safety. As they began walking, the desert stretched endlessly in all directions, but the traveler no longer felt overwhelmed. He noticed the subtle patterns in the sand, the movement of birds, and the distant shapes of hills. The desert was no longer a vast, unknowable place. It had become a teacher, revealing lessons to those willing to observe and learn. He moved with more confidence, keeping pace with the Apache, and he felt a growing sense of connection with the land. The journey was long, but it was also filled with small discoveries. The traveler began to notice the hidden beauty in the desert. Tiny flowers growing between rocks, the delicate tracks of animals in the sand, the changing colors of the sky as the sun climbed higher. He realized that survival was not just about enduring harsh conditions. It was about noticing and appreciating the life that thrived even in difficult circumstances. The Apache moved with ease through the landscape, pointing out details he might have missed, showing him how to read the land with care and respect. By late morning, they reached a small rocky ridge that offered a panoramic view of the desert below. The traveler paused, taking in the sight. He could see rolling dunes, scattered vegetation, and the faint traces of animal tracks winding through the sand. He felt a mixture of awe and gratitude. The desert was vast, but he no longer felt small and helpless. Instead, he felt part of something larger, aware of his place within this harsh but beautiful environment. The two Apaches led him to a shaded area beneath a few scattered trees. They settled down to rest, and one of them gestured for the traveler to drink water and eat a small portion of dried food. As he ate, he reflected on the journey. He had come into the desert weak, unsure, and unprepared, but he was leaving with knowledge, confidence, and a deeper understanding of himself. He realized that the true lesson of the desert was not just about survival. It was about growth, resilience, and the quiet strength that comes from facing challenges directly. The afternoon passed with more learning. The Apache showed him how to navigate using the position of the sun and subtle features of the landscape. They taught him how to find water in hidden areas, how to recognize signs of approaching storms, and how to protect himself from the harsh sun and wind. The traveler listened carefully, practicing each skill with their guidance. He felt proud of his progress, aware that he was no longer completely dependent on them. He could now contribute to his own safety and understanding, something he had not imagined possible just a few days ago. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in warm hues of orange and purple, the group made camp for the evening. The fire was lit, and the traveler sat between the two men, wrapped in blankets. He felt a deep sense of gratitude, not only for their protection but for the knowledge and patience they had shared. The desert had tested him, but it had also taught him valuable lessons about endurance, observation, and the importance of trusting those who know the land. That night, around the fire, one of the Apaches spoke softly. "You have learned much," he said, and the traveler felt a quiet pride swell within him. The journey had been difficult, even frightening at times, but he had grown stronger, wiser, and more confident. He realized that challenges, no matter how harsh, could become opportunities for learning and growth when faced with patience and determination. The fire crackled gently, and the desert seemed to listen as he reflected on the past days. As he lay down to sleep, the traveler thought about the moments that had shaped him. The first night of cold and fear, the sudden storm that had tested his courage, the long days of walking and observing, and the small triumphs of understanding and survival. Each memory was a reminder of the lessons he had learned and the resilience he had discovered within himself. He felt a new respect for the desert, not just as a place of hardship, but as a teacher and guide. The journey was nearing its end, and the traveler knew he would carry these lessons with him forever. He had learned that survival was not just about strength or endurance. It was about observation, patience, trust, and the courage to continue even when fear and uncertainty threatened to overwhelm. The two Apaches had guided him, but he had also found strength within himself, discovering capabilities he had not known existed. The next morning, the traveler woke to the soft light of dawn. The desert stretched out before him, calm and welcoming in a way it had never seemed before. The two men prepared for the final leg of the journey, and the traveler followed with confidence. Each step felt lighter, more assured. He noticed the small details, the rustle of leaves, the tracks in the sand, the distant shapes of hills and dunes, and he understood their meaning. He was no longer an outsider in this landscape. He had become a student of it, able to read its signs and move with its rhythm. As they walked, the traveler reflected on how much he had changed in just a few days. He had come into the desert fearful, cold, and unprepared. Now he was stronger, more observant, and more confident. He had learned to endure hardships, to trust in others, and to pay attention to the subtle lessons hidden in the world around him. The desert had tested him, but it had also rewarded him with knowledge, resilience, and a new perspective on life. By midday, they reached a point where the desert began to give way to gentler terrain. The traveler knew the journey was almost over. He felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief at having survived and learned so much, and sadness at leaving the Apache who had guided him and taught him so many valuable lessons. He realized that the people who guide us, protect us, and share their wisdom are as important as the challenges we face. Without them, he might have learned less, struggled more, or even failed. As they paused near the edge of a small valley, the two Apache turned to him. They spoke softly, their words simple but full of meaning. The traveler felt gratitude, respect, and a deep sense of connection. He understood that he had not only survived the desert but had grown stronger in body, mind, and spirit. He had learned to observe, endure, and trust. He had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. The traveler thanked them silently and aloud, feeling the depth of his appreciation. He knew he would never forget these days, the lessons of the desert, and the guidance of the two Apache who had protected him. As he prepared to leave, he felt a quiet determination to carry these lessons into his future. The desert had tested him, challenged him, and shaped him, and he was ready to move forward with confidence, respect, and resilience. As he walked away, leaving the small oasis behind, he looked back one last time. The two Apache stood quietly, watching him go. He felt a sense of completion, a sense that this journey had been a turning point in his life. He had faced fear, endured hardship, learned patience, and gained wisdom. The desert, once a place of uncertainty and danger, had become a teacher, and he had learned to listen, observe, and grow. With each step away from the oasis, the traveler carried the lessons of the desert in his mind and heart. He knew that life would present new challenges, but he felt prepared to face them with courage, patience, and determination. The Apache had shown him the way, but he had found strength within himself. And as he continued walking, he felt a quiet sense of peace, knowing that he had survived, learned, and grown in ways he had never imagined possible.